O meu objetivo agora, então, é apresentar rapidamente o professor Charles Waldheim. Eu tenho pouco tempo para essa apresentação e é sempre um grande desafio apresentar uma pessoa como o professor Charles, com um currículo muito vasto e bem-sucedido. Então, eu escolhi alguns pontos principais aqui dentro da minha leitura e gostaria, portanto, de apresentá-lo aqui para vocês. O professor Charles Waldheim é arquiteto e urbanista, certo? Ele é professor da cátedra John Irving, da Escola de Design da Universidade de Harvard, onde ele também dirige o escritório de urbanização dessa mesma escola de design. O professor Charles Waldheim foi ganhador da Fellowship da Academia Americana em Roma, catedrático da Cullinan Chair da Rice University e uma série de outras premiações aqui também muito relevantes que o professor Charles traz no seu currículo. A pesquisa dele examina as relações entre landscape, ecologia e urbanismo contemporâneo. Portanto, a participação do professor Charles é extremamente oportuna e essencial para a realização deste evento aqui. Então, gostaria agora com vocês de pedir aplausos aqui para nós chamarmos a participação do professor Charles Waldheim.
Thank you, Vinicius. And thanks to the Espaço Israel Pinheiro for your generous support, and thanks to all of you for coming out. It's wonderful to see such support for this topic here on a Monday afternoon, particularly when there's nothing going on in the capital. There's nothing going on. We've got nothing, nothing particularly else to be focused on here in Brazil. I know that my colleagues have already made acknowledgments, but I want to acknowledge our generous support for the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, Manuel in the Sao Paulo office, Marcela in the Santiago office. I also want to acknowledge the role that Felipe Vera, my friend and colleague, has played. It was he who first proposed doing a series like this focused on landscape in Latin America. And around that, we've been very fortunate to rally an extraordinary group of colleagues. You'll meet them over the course of the afternoon. Luis Calles from Medellin, and of course, Pedro Caroline here working out of Rio. I also want to acknowledge from the Office of Urbanization, Helen Kongsgaard. For those of us in North America, and for many in many parts of the world, over the last couple of decades, we could say that landscape has emerged as an important medium for thinking about the shape of the city. This has come to be known through the rubric of landscape urbanism, or landscape as urbanism. And so, in terms of the intellectual content of the afternoon and of our series, our goal has been to ask a very simple question. We know that this discourse, we know that these practices have been found useful in a range of places around the world. In North America, in Western Europe, in Asia, in the Gulf, you can find these practices and this discourse available and has been productive for many, many people. At the same time, it's not a conversation that we've associated with Latin America or South America. And in fact, compared to any other part of the developed world, South America has invested less in the development of landscape architecture historically. And before we presume to know why that is, we thought we would go on a tour and ask a kind of simple question, which is this conversation at all interesting for you? That is, it's a conversation that's been productive elsewhere. And at the same moment, I don't want to presuppose what it might mean here in the Americas. And so we identified initially 3 cities and a range of partnering institutions to help us ask this question. We started in Medellin like a year and a half ago. It was a week ago. We started in Medellin, in which we began by looking at cities that had some evidence of landscape culture, right? Some evidence of design culture and some evidence. And so in Santiago, and now here in Brasilia, we have cities that enjoy landscape programs, and obviously a deep history. For those of you that are new to the topic, the way that I would introduce the topic to you is essentially a set of alternative practices that have emerged in the last 15 or 20 years. These are practices mostly coming from architecture that have to do with concern for the urbanism, the shape of the city, that began to question the limits of the architectural model. I was trained as an architect. I was led to believe, by very well-intentioned institutions, that architecture was the basic building block of the city. In a variety of contexts, for a variety of reasons, we may have reached the limit of that logic. And in that context, landscape has been proposed in many, many places around the world as an alternative to that dominance of the architectural model. Landscape brings with it a lot of history, a lot of baggage also, but it also enables us to talk about environmental performance, ecological function. And of course, while I'm showing you a drawing by Ludwig Hilbersheimer, the German planner, we're sitting here, of course, in Brasilia, ending our tour in one of the world's greatest experiments in urban form. It's an urban form that, as much as anything else, was derived and is driven by landscape. The public realm, the medium of urban space, the medium of social intercourse here in Brasilia is landscape. The buildings are significant. They are, of course, consequential, but the overwhelming shape of the city and its public realm are given by landscape. And in this regard, my own interests in Hilbersheimer's work might open a conversation. And so each of these three cities, we've organized a set of conversations, beginning in Medellin, continuing in Santiago, and now here in Brasilia, to try to answer that question. And if it's not landscape that's relevant for you today, what is it? What might be the most relevant way of discussing these topics if we're interested in environmental health, if we're interested in ecological performance? Is there another language? Is there another conceptual framework that might be? And so far, I think we're 2-0. I think in both Medellin and in Santiago, it's become clear that there's a generational shift in the practices of young architects. This is in the context of social and political changes across the region in the last 25 years or so. It's in the context of what has been a generally improving economic condition until recently. And in that, young architects around the region have identified publicly as landscape urbanists. And that's interesting because it's done so really in distinction, in contradiction to the more dominant historic model. The more dominant historic model in this part of the world has been, from my experience, a Mediterranean model in which the architect is the urbanist. And that model, while it's been quite productive, tends to place environmental performance, ecological health, sustainability outside the city. Yeah. And so I also want to say 2 words very briefly about the institutional context in which I'm working. So it's my great pleasure to serve as the founding director of a new research unit at the Harvard GSD called the Office for Urbanization. And so this is just the beginning of that conversation, but I did want to place our discussions today in the context of that office because it might be something that we can continue with as a conversation going forward in the coming weeks and months and years. In the Office for Urbanization, we're interested to try to describe something we call design research. Because if we're not going to simply work as architects, if we're not going to simply work as landscape architects or urban planners or urban designers, we need some other identity. And so our school decided about 80 years ago that the identity would be design. And it was among the first schools in the world, certainly in the English language, to choose to do this. So at the Office for Urbanization, we spent some time trying to clarify, well, what do we mean by design? What is that activity? How do we qualify it? How do we evaluate it? How is it different than fashion or opinion, right? Or taste culture? And so in that regard, we've been rereading Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon, you might recall, was the Nobel laureate economist, really political theorist, political scientist, who articulated in the late 1960s an idea about design. He argued that, among other things, the sciences are concerned with how things are, right? The sciences are concerned with describing the world as it is. And design, on the other hand, is best defined as being concerned with how things ought to be. And what we're focusing on there is the ought to be, the world as it should be, right? And the ethical, maybe even moral implications of that. And the idea of design, the responsibility of design, to not only imagine that condition of what ought to be, but to begin to envision it, to be able to illustrate it, to talk about what might be possible. In the office, we build upon the graduate school's history of addressing societal and environmental conditions. We're interested in developing speculative and projected urban scenarios through a range of sponsored design research projects. Our mission is to imagine. Our job is to think things up, to imagine alternative and better urban futures. Our vision, what we hope to accomplish, is we want to reduce the distance, the time, between the innovations in design that happen in the school all the time, which we have a track record of, and the impact of our students' work in the world. We know that our students go on, and our faculty go on to have great impact in the world, and we want to shorten that timeline. We could also say, from the perspective of the city, thinking about urbanization today, that the challenges we face in cities around the world do not really correspond to traditional disciplinary or professional identities. Yeah? We don't want to be building a new profession or a new academic degree program every time we have a new challenge, right? We don't want to develop a new master's degree in the Zika virus. We don't want to have a new degree or professional identity every time we have a challenge. At the same time, I believe, and my colleagues believe, that we cannot afford the luxury of simply maintaining our existing professional and disciplinary identities in the face of rapid and ongoing and increasing change. Right? And so it's that tension between our own identity as architects, urbanists, landscape architects, planners, and the challenges we face. We work under this rubric of design research across disciplines. And so again, for us, Herbert Simon has become quite significant as an historical precedent. He published a little book called The Sciences of the Artificial. And in The Sciences of the Artificial, in '69, he argued that design is really at the core of all professional training, whether you're being trained in medicine, in law, public health, engineering, or in fact architecture, urban planning. Design is really at the heart of that. And he ultimately develops a theory that could distinguish the professional school in the context of a research university in its role. This is important for us because very often in the context of a research university, design can be seen to be trivial. If you're on a campus in which the arts and sciences or the other more sober, more historically grounded professions have dominance, design can be often relegated to fashion, look and feel, nice glasses, I like your shoes. And in the end, ultimately, we believe that design is quite much more significant than that. Design can actually improve the world. We can at least begin by imagining an alternative to that world. We know that design research is synthetic. We know that it incorporates information from an array of different disciplines. We know that our work is characterized by our ability to organize and display that information visually. We know that we often deploy simulations and scenario-based strategies. We know that our work is most often propositional, right? Our work is different from the sciences in that we propose. If we don't propose, we're not operating in design research. Ultimately, perhaps the most profound implication of this is that our work in design then stands in a double valence, a double status in two ways. On the one hand, our work in the office stands as a proposition for how to change the world, to make the world as it ought to be. At the same moment, that work also stands as a body of knowledge. It stands as a way of understanding the world in the same form that it does in other disciplines. We have a range of topics that we're interested in and already begun work on. And in this context, I would simply mention among the topics we're interested in is the contemporary condition of the new town. Now, the new town is obviously not news to you. You've been living this history here for some time. And at the same moment, the cultural and political audacity to build a new city from scratch has, of course, its own historic reception. The challenges we face today is that while, by and large, a lot of the assumptions around planning the new town have been discredited in the urban arts, we continue to urbanize. And so for many of us, and certainly those of us in the office, we believe that it's timely to return to the best precedents of modern planning, the best examples of modern planning that had social vision, social aspiration, could improve the lives of people on an everyday basis, but also had environmental vision that could improve the environmental health, the ecological function, and the sustainability of the places where we live. And so that's why we're here in Brasilia to end our tour, because this city, as much as any city in the world that I've ever been in, has that combination of social aspiration, environmental health, and a progressive design agenda. I understand that mistakes were made. We're here to learn from you about what not to repeat. But again, Brasilia is for me among the most interesting examples in the world of an urban form that was conceived not primarily as a work of architecture, but primarily fundamentally as a work of landscape, or landscape as urbanism. I wanted to share with you just briefly before closing a couple of images of some things we've learned from our colleagues over the last week or two, and to set the table a little bit for the conversation that you're going to be hearing. As I mentioned, it's my belief that we're seeing a generational shift across Latin America in which architects primarily, especially architects of a certain age, a certain generation, have been radicalized around environmental issues. These are architects that are working in the context of social and political change, but also in the context of a generally speaking opening of the economy and an openness to an international discourse. This idea of asking this question here in Latin America first occurred to me a few years ago when I had the great pleasure to meet my friend Luis Callejas and his partners in the firm that was then identified as Paisajes Emergentes out of Colombia. So in their work in Medellin, you can see it here in their aquatic center that was built a couple of years ago, a practice that early on audaciously selected the term landscape as the first word in their professional identity. And for an architect of international caliber and with great ambition to choose that identity, of course, was news to me, and that's a part of what led to the conversation that ultimately brought Luis to collaborate with us at the GSD. I think that the Aquatic Center is among the most interesting, compelling examples of this tendency in work that I've seen over the course of the last several years. We'll hear more from Luis today about his work and proposal in Rio, so I won't say much about that. But I do want to suggest that while these are very, very different contexts, different cities, I don't want to generalize across cultures and across countries. At the same moment, there's now enough evidence, not simply one practice here or there. I'll draw your attention to another Colombian practice, Latitude. This is their project of a couple of years ago for the Medellin River renovation, in which we see a direct engagement with the discourse and practices of landscape urbanism, and in which there's the idea of including design culture into improving the health and function, the social life and the environmental performance of that piece of the city. Equally, Latitude's project for the airport renovation in Caracas is notable here as addressing and invoking a whole range of processes and strategies that we could now broadly identify as landscape urbanists in nature. In this regard, the work of Camilo Restrepo and his colleagues, Plan B and others working in Medellin for their Orchid House is a great built project. It's a great exemplar of this tendency in which we have an unlikely combination of influences. It's the influence or the combination of a deep, deep interest in orders in the natural world, so the botanical, the ecological, coming to shape the work of an architect who's practicing at a very serious level internationally. And equally in that regard, I think Luis's project for the Medellin River is significant here, particularly given the way that it rejected the dominant tendency toward the making of a linear park along the river in favor of a series of discrete infrastructural interventions at the sites of a series of creeks that enter at right angles to that river. Kappa's work is also interesting here, coming out of Colombia. You may have heard or seen their work before as well. Extraordinary interest in representation, just hallucinatory kind of drawing quality, in which there's an interest in the environmental world. How do we understand nature and how it informs the work that we do? In Santiago, we were interested to host Alfredo Ramirez, among others, the Mexican landscape architect and architect who's based in the AA in London. And he shared with our audiences his work in Mexico City. His firm is called Ground Lab. And he's, again, an architect coming from the region, from Mexico, in Mexico City, and then proposing to develop a landscape urbanist agenda through the AA Landscape Urbanism Unit. And then doing projects in which, again, river ecology, the lacustrine ecology of the Mexico City basin form the basis for a way of thinking about the city. That was interesting for us because we were able to bring Alfredo to be in Santiago in time to this week commemorate the opening of their project for a piece of Santiago in collaboration with Danielle Martic and Leon Bosch and others. And their project is, again, indicative of these tendencies. And so after about a half a dozen of these practices, I'm no longer surprised when I see this tendency. Now, I don't want to presume to know precisely how to evaluate this work, but it is very much for us a pressing question. Should we think of this rubric, should we think of this thematic of landscape structuring the city as relevant here or not? Is it simply an historic model, or is it something that's available in contemporary practice? we can now identify a dozen practices across South America that are practicing in this way, and that begins to give us some sense. In this regard, I wanted to touch on, again, Pedro and Carolyn's own practice, plus Steve, they'll say more about it today in their own remarks, but I do think that you see here a project which is socially engaged, interested in technology, in which the architect is really leading what, I don't know if it's a landscape project per se, but it could be framed that way, and so the environmental health and the social conditions being addressed simultaneously. UNE architects working in Sao Paulo, I think, would also be easily fit within this framework, and again, we'll hear more about these kinds of projects over the coming hours. I also want to just mention that it's not simply at the scale of urban design, there are also a range of interesting geographic or territorial projects in this region that might also be relevant for a conversation here. So again, thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon. We're here very much in the spirit of goodwill and collaboration. We're here very much to learn from you, and so please do participate with the conversation. Please do ask questions. Please engage with us. Because it very much is a question for us. We'd like to come back from this tour with a clearer sense of what the discourse is here and how we might be able to continue the conversation going forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Charles. We're looking forward to a great afternoon here with you all.